In this episode of Beyond at Home, I'm going to talk about the things that get in the way of you getting what you really want. And I'm going to help you get rid of those things that prevent you from getting what you really want. And I'm going to tell you what this shiny object has to do with all of that. Let's go. Now, this is episode 2 of this conversation that we've been having called How to Get What You Really Want. So if you haven't seen episode 1, go back and watch that first before picking up here. Because last week, right at the very end of the episode, I hinted at this idea that we will never get what we really want until we discover what we really value. Now, the great news is that if you wouldn't consider yourself a Jesus follower or you're not really a church person, this question it can be helpful for you as well. In fact, this question applies to all people. But if you are a Jesus follower, this kind of goes a step further. In fact, Jesus points towards the fact and Jesus highlights the fact that we will never get what we really want until we discover what is most valuable. Now, you can't go as far as that. If you would say, Chris, I'm not really sure that Jesus is God and all of that stuff, that's okay. You don't have to go that far. That's only Jesus followers that have to go that far. Here's where I want to begin in this episode. I want to highlight the tension that choosing what's valuable is actually unnatural. And here's where this shiny object comes in. Well, let's say you have a destination that you want to get. Whether it's in relationships, whether it's in finances, you've identified something that you really want. Let's just take an example from my life. Like something that I really want is I want to get healthier, right? I want to have a healthier diet. I want to exercise more. I want to be more consistent at that. And so I set out on this journey. And then what happens is I drive past McDonald's. And that's one of these shiny objects. And before I know what's going on or what's happening, I'm at the drive-thru at McDonald's ordering a large double quarter pounder meal with a double cheeseburger on the side. Like, I don't know how it happens, but it does. And chances are in your life that there are some things that you set out. You're like, hey, this is what I really want the most. And then what happens is a shiny object comes along. Something to distract you from what's most valuable because it's actually unnatural to focus on the things we value the most. It's actually so much easier and so much more natural in our lives to get pulled towards these shiny objects. Now, here's the thing. If you've ever had a moment in your life where you've been distracted by a shiny object or by a want in your life, you might have thought that the way to kind of overcome that is more information. You might have thought that the way to overcome that is more discipline. But here's the reality is that so many people never get what they really want because they think the answer to getting what they really want is a little bit more discipline or a little bit more information. But that could not be further from the truth. Because there's almost, and it feels like there's almost this battle going on inside of us between what we want ultimately and what we want in the moment, these shiny objects. And I think the person who describes this battle the best and will help us break through to get what we really want is a guy by the name of Paul. And Paul is someone who at one point in time wasn't a Jesus follower. In fact, he hated Jesus followers. And then he had an encounter and an experience and he became a Jesus follower and he started a whole bunch of churches all around the Mediterranean rim. But there was one church in one area that Paul hadn't gotten to, but he really wanted to get to. And it was the church in Rome. And the church in Rome wasn't like churches that we would see in our world today. In fact, Rome was not a great place to be if you're a Jesus follower in the first century. And so the church in Rome was probably like 12 to 15 house churches. And Paul writes this letter to them. And at this one point in the letter, Paul discusses this internal conflict that all of us have between what we want in the moment and what we ultimately value. And this is how he starts it out. He says, I do not understand what I do. And maybe you've had a moment like that where you think to yourself like, why did I eat that? Why did I sleep in? Why did I say yes to that thing? So now that we're all on the same page, this is what Paul says. He says, for what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. And I just love how transparent Paul is here when he writes that because he articulates what all of us have experienced. And maybe some of you would not go as far to say, well, I don't hate myself, but yeah, I really did not like the fact that I just couldn't seem to do what I wanted to do. But maybe for others of you watching this video, there's been some things that you've done. You set out with one intention and something got in the road and you did what you didn't mean to do. And now looking back, you kind of hate yourself for the fact that you did those things, or you said those things, or you jumped into that relationship, you jumped out of that relationship. And if that's you, Paul would say that he gets it and he understands it. And this isn't a one-off battle. This is an everyday battle. And he goes on. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. Now here I think that Paul is referring to a time before he was a Jesus follower, when he was part of a Jewish group of religious leaders called the Pharisees, who were so well known for how good they were at keeping the law. Now, Paul's problem wasn't that he was bad at keeping the law. His problem was that he was so good at keeping the law. And even though he was so good at keeping the law, he still couldn't do what he wanted to do. Now, obviously, you and I, we're not Jewish, or maybe you are, but I'm not Jewish, and so you might not understand what this law is. So we can just think of it in a general sense of right or wrong. There are some things that are right that we know we should do, but we just struggle to do it. We struggle to do it relationally in our own lives, and we have standards that we fall short of. And this is what Paul goes on. He says this, he says, for I have the desire, like I want to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. And this next part's a little bit of a tongue twister. He says, for I do not do the good I want to do, but I do the evil I do not want to do. This I keep on doing. Now, this should kind of make you feel a little bit better about yourself. Maybe you're someone who you struggle to connect with the idea of Jesus because Jesus is God. But Paul is someone who wrote over half the New Testament. And Paul says, look, there are things I want to do that I just kind of fall short of. This is gritty. This is real what Paul is talking about. And the point that he's driving home is simply this. What we naturally want is often in conflict with what we ultimately want. All of us have gotten what we naturally wanted in the moment, only to discover that it wasn't what we ultimately wanted. And to highlight this point a little further, I want to show you what Paul wrote in another letter that he wrote to a church that he actually started in the city of Galatia. And Paul actually talks about what happens when we follow our natural wants. He says this, he says, it is obvious what kind of life develops from trying to get our own way all the time. Now, when Paul talks about getting our own way, he's talking about this idea that Jesus spoke about, that other New Testament authors spoke about, that there's actually something fundamentally broken about human nature. Now, you don't have to agree with me. I just want to tell you what Paul taught, what Jesus taught, and what the New Testament taught, that there is something fundamentally broken about human nature that no matter how hard we try to get what we ultimately want, things will get in the way. And it's okay what you might disagree, but Paul kind of just says, hey, let's imagine we got a whiteboard and let's imagine that we all got our own way for a second. Here are some of the things that come out. And as I read some of these things out, see if they've ever come out in your life. He says this, he says, this is what happens when we try to get our own way. We get repetitive, loveless, cheap sex, a stinking accumulation of mental and emotional garbage, frenzied and joyless grabs for happiness, trinket gods, magic show religion, paranoid loneliness, cutthroat competition, all-consuming yet never satisfied wants, a brutal temper, an impotence to love or be loved, divided homes and divided lives, small-minded and lopsided pursuits, the vicious habit of depersonalizing everyone into a rival, uncontrolled and uncontrollable addictions and ugly parodies of community. And in case there's something that came to your mind that Paul didn't say in that list, he says this. He says, I could go on. Now, I know that this is the type of message that can seem all doom and gloom. And I don't mean it to come across that way. All I want to do is highlight this tension, that there's this thing within us that grabs for what we want naturally and distracts us from what we want ultimately. And I wanted to spend some time to really bring this tension front and center to show you how important it is. And you might be thinking to yourself, yeah, but you haven't told us what to do about that, Chris. Well, that's what we're going to do now. Now, last week, I introduced you to Jesus' brother, James. And James actually paints this word picture for what I want us to do in between now and the time you watch the next episode. This is what James says. He says, temptation comes from our own desires or wants, which entice us and drag us away. This is that shiny object syndrome I was talking about. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. See, it starts off as what we ultimately value. And this thing called sin, it starts as an idea. And then it grows and it grows and it grows into this shiny object that distracts us and pulls us away from what we want ultimately. And then in the end, this shiny object ends up killing the thing we ultimately want. And James goes on and he says this. He says, so don't be misled, my dear brothers and sisters. And it's almost like James here reaches out through 2,000 years of history and grabs you and grabs me by the collar. And he says, hey, don't be misled from the shiny objects in your life. They might be what you want now, but they're not ultimately what you want the most. So here's 3 homework questions that I want you to do based on what James says that will help you not get so distracted by the shiny objects of your life. Here's the first one I want you to ask. What do you really want? And if you don't know where to start with this, just write down a list of, hey, what do you want? And then once you've got that list in front of you, I want you to ask yourself a second question. Why do you want it? That will begin to help you discover what you really want. Then the second question I want you to ask is, what's dragging me away? In other words, what are the shiny objects in your life that are dragging you away from what you ultimately want? And then the final question is a little bit of an odd question, but I want you to bear with me and I want you to ask it anyway. And the question is this: how long do you plan to what you want naturally drag you away from what you want ultimately? Right? Because it's so easy to say like, I'll address that one day. I'll address that soon. I'll get around to it. But no, let's put a number on it. Is it going to be 6 months? Is it going to be a year? Is it going to be 5 years? Is it going to be 10 years? How long are you going to allow the shiny objects in your life drag you away from what you want ultimately? So answer those 3 questions at the end of this episode, and then tune back in for episode 3 as we talk about how to get what you really want.